Good morning or afternoon, and welcome to day 2 of the Plan With Me challenge. So, yesterday was really supposed to be inspirational, but also not just to give you an overview of the Caribbean, but to get you thinking about travel planning in a slightly different way, of rather than focusing first on the destination, focusing first on the type of trip you want to have. Now, that applies to the Caribbean and the islands, but it can apply to any trip, whether you want to go to Central America or Europe and think about a city stay versus a farm stay versus a beach stay, or what are you envisioning for your trip? And by starting your planning that way, it might allow you to be a bit more open to destinations you might not have thought about before that turn out to align with exactly what you're looking for. So we always start our trip planning interviews with clients with those types of questions of what type of trip are you envisioning. Today, though, I want to get into the work a little bit. I hope that you generated a list yesterday of island destinations that might be appealing to you based on what we discussed. And today I want to talk about flights. We're going to spend the day on Google Flights today. Two ways to think about flights. One is as a trip planning tool. I have a certain type of Caribbean trip in mind, and I want to figure out now with my list of possible destinations which one I might be able to get to with good flights. That's the one we're going to focus on today. Dates and general destinations in mind, but using flights to narrow down where you're going to go. The second part of trip planning is flight planning is when you already have a destination in mind and you're trying to find the best flights. I have a couple tips at the end of today's video about how to look for flights when you already know where you want to go and maybe you're a little bit more flexible on when you want to go. But what I want to start with first is how do we use flights to maybe refine our destination choice as well. I want to talk too about price versus desired flights. I think that when we think about flights, we often think about finding the best deal, finding the cheapest flights. But if any of you who have traveled with kids before know that sometimes those cheapest flights are not the best flights. I would like to start this process by thinking about what are the desired flights. What flights would make your destination, your trip easier? And then you can always think about, well, is that perfect flight really worth the money? Or do I need to make some changes to save some money to make this trip within budget? And so that is sort of like a different approach maybe than we think about, which I do think is always about like finding the cheapest flights. But I've been on a lot of flights getting home with my kids at 1 or 2 in the morning where I would have paid a couple $100 more to have gotten home earlier in that moment. But when you're planning for flights, it's hard to keep that in mind. But let's start by thinking about how we use Google Flights. I'm going to use as a destination a starting date, one spring break, potential spring break week for next year of March 15th to 22nd. So assume this is your spring break for next year, but you should play along with this, get in Google Flights, and do some of this research based on your own spring break dates. But I always start with Saturday to Saturday when I'm doing Caribbean flights because most direct flights to the Caribbean are Saturday to Saturday or Sunday to Sunday, unless you live in Miami or New York, in which case you probably get daily flights. But I like to start Saturday to Saturday and look around. So I put in Saturday to Saturday. I'm going to put in my home destination. I'm going to start by doing an airport specific because I know my perfect flights might be leaving out of JFK, even though I could leave out of 2 other airports in New York. So start by what you want, and then we can go broadly from there. But let's say I want to fly Saturday to Saturday from JFK in New York, not any New York airport, and I want to go to the Caribbean. Where can I go? So this is how I always start my searches, is from the airport I'd really like to leave from to the Caribbean on the dates that I want to leave. So start specific on your airport, and then you can change from there. And I want to use these buttons to narrow. So I would love a direct flight. We would always love a direct flight. I would also, if you go over here, I would really love that flight to leave after 9 in the morning because maybe I don't want to get up at 5 in the morning to start my trip. And I would like to return in a way where I don't arrive home in the middle of the night. I would like to arrive home between noon and 7 p.m. You can see it happening over here. These are narrowing our options right away. And maybe, oops, I think I just lost my filter. Oh yeah, okay, nonstop. Maybe I only want my flight to be under 4 hours. Oh, you're going to lose a lot there. So this is where you start to see the easy accessible destinations that I mentioned before. It's going to be the Bahamas, it's going to be Turks and Caicos, it's going to be Jamaica. And you can start to see estimated pricing for what those flights might look like and how long they might be. You can start narrowing by airport as well. Sometimes it changes, and then if you're like, okay, that's a start, but I'm willing to go to a different airport in New York, so you go more broadly, and it only changed a little bit. It brought in Bermuda, which I often forget about up here in the corner. I'm going to get rid of the under 4 hours because that really limits things. But then also, some flights are going to be only on Sundays. So I'm going to switch Sunday to Sunday and see what happens. Well, it doesn't look like that brought in anything new, but I will say often, from Washington, D.C., at least where I live, I see a real difference if I go Sunday to Sunday versus Saturday to Saturday. And then finally, I get a lot of clients that say they'd only like to go away for 5 or 6 days. So that would require a difference in days, and that's when I start to play around with it. What if we do Sunday to Friday? Direct flights. Those destinations are all still there. This is actually a little bit more illustrative if you pick a different airport other than New York, because New York has such great flights. But let's say I'm going Washington, D.C. to the Caribbean. Sunday to Friday, I can really only get to the Dominican Republic direct. Saturday to Saturday, I can get to Puerto Rico. Sunday to Sunday, usually I thought I can get to St. Martin, but I'm not seeing it today. Oh, I'm going to go back and clear out and then you just have to remember to check this, clear out my flight times. I actually like leaving early. There we go. So now Sunday to Sunday, I can get to St. Martin, which is one of my favorite destinations for like beach cafes and cool dining and some small affordable boutique hotels. So that's one of my favorites. If you can get direct flights to St. Martin and are looking for an affordable trip, that's a really great choice. Barbados actually has more direct flights than people realize, including from DC, Sunday to Sunday on United. That's a great choice. And so by playing around with that, I can start to see where I can get direct. Okay. I also want to think about when you can't get direct and you want to change your searches accordingly. So get rid of that nonstop filter, put one stop on. I'm Sunday to Sunday now at this point from any airport in Washington, D.C., one stop or fewer. And you're starting to see a lot more options if I'm willing to connect. But this doesn't tell you anything about how bad that connection is going to be. So for example, I'd love the idea of going to Antigua, and $542 seems like a pretty good choice. Over here, you can see that $542 trip is actually from my favorite airport, which is Reagan, and an overall travel time of 7 hours. So I'm much more likely to click into this search now and start to look at what that trip might look like because those flight times are pretty good. But if I look, for example, at Grenada, I think, oh, $920 isn't as bad as I might have thought to Grenada. But look at that flight time, 17 hours and 45 minutes. So that must mean an overnight stop somewhere. And if I get rid of that flight, the prices are much higher. So this can sometimes be a confusing map to look at because the number that's being shown could be for a really terrible flight path. So another way to filter around with that is through duration. I like to opt to sometimes bring this down under 12 hours because that usually means not an overnight stop. If you can bring it down to 12 hours, and then the prices that you're going to see on this map as you're exploring are going to be a little bit more reflective of flights you might actually want to take. And then you can start to look around again. I'm going to go back to Saturday. And I think, oh, see, and there's a big difference between Bonaire and Curacao. And that might, for a family of 5, this flight difference is going to mean $2,500. And so that might really help you to narrow that Curacao could be a great option for your trip if you start to look at these flights versus Bonaire, which is going to be more expensive and hard to get to. I always want to encourage you to be open to traveling on off days. So if you look at the difference between Saturday to Saturday for some destinations and Thursday to Thursday, you will really see a difference. So you saw before Grenada was up at $1,200 on a Saturday to Saturday flight. Again, one of my favorite islands to get to. If you go Thursday to Thursday here, it brings that flight price down to $565. That's a huge difference. And depending on the age of your kids, consider whether you're willing to miss a couple of days of school, even one day of school, to make the trip happen that you really want to have happen. So once I sort of land on my list of destinations, now what you can do is go through that list you made yesterday and start to take a look as to like which destinations in the Caribbean might actually have some good flights for you. I wanted to give a little bit more thought on sort of like what I think of like as good flights. So I would recommend on layover on the way down to the Caribbean, 45 to 60 minutes. Whether I'm willing to do 45 minutes often depends on whether there's another flight behind my connecting flight later that day. I don't want to be in a position where if I miss that 45-minute connection, there's not another flight to the island. So I'll do a 45-minute connection in Miami on American to an island that has a couple of flights a day. If there's only 2 flights a week, I'm probably not taking that 45-minute connection. If you're running a lot of searches and you're seeing a lot of 35 to 45-minute connections in Miami for your flights, I always recommend considering and playing around with flight prices on going down the night before. There is an airport hotel in Miami that is clean. It's right in the terminal. It has a good restaurant. You can fly in the night before to Miami, take sleep, and then catch that first morning early flight to the islands. You often can get an earlier flight than you would have had you started your day connecting. It breaks it up with kids, and you're not going to be as worried about the connection. Another option is to look about connecting through JFK. There's a great terminal airport there as well. The TWA Hotel, that's a lot of fun. It has a rooftop pool. You can start your trip off that way and break up that connection. So those are 2 airports where I often think about if you're not seeing flights that work for you to destinations you're interested in on the way down, think about whether you could stay overnight at one of those airports on like the night before your trip. I also am always more eager to fly back home in the United States through Charlotte or even one of the airports in Texas or Atlanta. Atlanta's hit or miss, but over Miami, I find that like the Miami airport coming back into Miami is the worst airport. Give yourself at least 90 minutes coming back into Miami and skip Miami altogether, in my opinion, if you can on the way home. So I get much more excited about a connecting flight home through Charlotte than I do through Miami. We also have had great luck staying at the Miami airport overnight on the way home. So most flights to the Caribbean leave Miami or New York early in the morning and then return late in the afternoon, which often means you're getting back to Miami around 8 or 9 o'clock, and then you're catching another flight home. And with kids, that can be a real challenge. Whereas if you get back to Miami around 8 o'clock and you go to the airport hotel, have dinner in the airport, get some sleep, and then fly home early in the morning. If you're doing a Saturday to Saturday trip, you still get home early Sunday morning. You have the rest of the day to unpack before school starts or what have you. I find that connection on the way home in Miami has really saved us a lot of times too. So we personally have done that overnight stay in Miami multiple times on both ends, different ends of the trip. I don't usually do it on both ends of the trip, the same trip, but either at the front or at the back, depending on the trip that you're taking. The last thing I want to sort of mention was destinations that you're like really interested in going. Like you saw what I did here for Grenada. If it's a destination that you're really interested in going, first, you can always click into that destination. And in case you haven't used this before, make sure to go to the date grid, which is really helpful to show you the combination. If you're going Saturday to Saturday, we were looking at those $1,200 flights. If you were going Thursday to Thursday, it shows you the grid, what's going to be more affordable. It's a really great way to see if there's any variation in flights. The other thing you can always do is track prices. So I track prices for specific flights. So you can track prices for just those dates that you want right here. Like I know I want to travel this spring break week. Or you can track prices for any dates. So you might have really gotten like Bonaire in mind in terms of like that offshore snorkeling, and you're willing to maybe think about whether to take your kids out of school, or Bonaire actually turns out to be outside the hurricane zone. It's a great destination for summer travel. which, by the way, if you're interested in that, email me, let me know, or put that on the Ask Me Anything question form, and we can talk about sort of which of these destinations are better for different times a year. But you can track flights here for any dates. Set a grid so that you can see if flights to Grenada, if any of them drop down significantly, you'll get an alert when there are lower flights, and you can look at that. That's usually only worth it if you have flexible dates. Otherwise, you're just going to get frustrated. So those are my best tips on using flights to figure out like how to refine your trip plan. Is to figure out where you might want to go, and thinking about using Google Flights to track it out. And I did want to take 1 second to show you how to best use the spreadsheet that I for today's task. What I do, you want to just save this somewhere, right? Like I want to save that Grenada flight, and I don't have to remember another time, like what day was it again that had the cheap flights? Whenever I see a flight that I like, I always screenshot it. So this is the return flight. So you want to do both. Usually I just screenshot this. You can screenshot the whole connection, but I always just start by screenshotting this. And then I'm going to go over to my spreadsheet, which has a space for you to do flight research, and just put it on your spreadsheet. This does not need to be fancy. It does not need to be precise. Save those flight prices. And then also, what I like, I did give you a little bit of a trick here just to make it easy for you. Grenada, the starting flight price is $565. If you need 5 tickets or 6 tickets because you're bringing grandparents with you, then this will be able to show you the general amount that you should be expecting to pay for flights. So you can see how that $1,200 really added up to impact the overall cost of your flights. And you might make some notes here about that as well, but now you at least have the best flights saved. So if you need to go back to it later, you remember which dates that you can search and what those connections looked like. So that's how I save my flight research. Like I said, it's like imprecise, but it gets what I need in the same place, and it does let me over time. So take that brain dump from yesterday and the islands you were looking at, play around with flights, and then you can kind of start to impact what the flights might look like to these destinations. Okay, I hope this helps. The last thing I'll say about into the video today is a little bit, we haven't talked about like planning your trip budget yet. I also tend to think that you're better off waiting to set a budget for a trip once you start to think about the trip investment. Like, what do you want to do with this trip? Like, let's investigate the flights. Let's investigate the hotels, which is what we're going to talk about tomorrow, and the activities, and then start to think about, is this a trip that I can afford? And if it is, great. And if it's not, what changes can I make to bring it into budget? But I do sometimes find that if you start with budget, this trip planning process gets to be a lot more stressful because you're evaluating your options based on your budget and what you can accomplish, rather than thinking about the investment that you want to make with your kids in this trip and finding the trip that works for you, and then taking stock and saying, okay, this is the trip I want. How can I do it within my price point? How do I do it within my budget? Is it worth spending that little bit more to have that trip I really want? Or is it not? And maybe I save this trip for another time. But I like to do some of this legwork up front before I set a firm budget in my mind, if only to make the process of planning feel less stressful at the beginning. If you're always thinking about dollar signals. Again, think about the travel experience that you want, and then you can start to think about how to cut back from there. So save multiple flights that are the cheaper flights and the desired direct flights, and start to think about overall how these things all interact. Okay, tomorrow we get to talk about hotels, which is my favorite part. I hope you found this helpful and gave you some tips that you didn't know before about searching with Google Flights to narrow down your destinations.